Now, I will recognize Mr. Posey for 5 minutes for his legislation.
Thank you very much, Chairman and members of the China Task Force, for the opportunity to discuss two issues of significance to Florida, to my district, to all of your districts, and of course to our national security, the protection of our space launch industry, and the life-saving pharmaceuticals. I urge the task force to consider supporting H.R. 6783, the American Space Commerce Act, and H.R. 5982, the Safe Medicine Act. These are bipartisan bills that I introduced with Democrat co-leads. The American Space Commerce Act extends existing space launch incentives for additional 10 years for companies that launch their payloads from American soil. The Safe Medicine Act will help us end our dependence on pharmaceuticals coming from China, which, as you know, places a lower value on safety and has a record of sending contaminated drugs to America. From protecting our space launch industry to keeping contaminated pharmaceuticals out of our country, the common threat is China. China and other countries have taken notice of U.S. market growth in the commercial space arena and are funding their own launch vehicle development, providing direct subsidies to their companies, which compete with and take the market share away from American commercial space launch companies. This is not only an unfair trade practice, but a direct threat to our national security. The 2019 report to Congress of the U.S.-China Economic Security Review Commission states that China is taking steps to establish a commanding position in the commercial space launch and satellite sectors, relying in part on aggressive state-backed financing that foreign market-driven companies cannot match. The report further states China has already succeeded in undercutting the United States and other foreign launch and satellite providers in the international market, threatening to hollow out these countries' space industrial bases. The best interest of our national security is to stop that. Foreign launch providers are heavily subsidized by their governments and use those subsidies to undercut American competitors, materially harming these American companies and our American industrial base. Another national security interest of the United States is protecting contaminated pharmaceuticals coming from China. 80% of the drugs that Americans depend upon come from overseas countries, including China, whose pharmaceuticals have been subject to numerous recalls, is the largest provider of drugs and drug ingredients. As a result, our complete dependence on China, we have not produced basic medicine like penicillin in the United States since 2004. In 2008, a Chinese-based pharmaceutical company pumped counterfeit blood clot medication into our domestic markets to turn a quick buck. The result, 81 Americans died. 785 more were severely injured. And yet, because officials were afraid of creating a shortage, they allowed the Chinese-made heparin to continue to enter the country without inspecting it. Crises like these keep on happening. When the U.S. Food and Drug Administration testified before Congress in the 2008 contamination crisis, they insisted that we must also remember that this is an essential drug and we can't simply stop the heparin supply. Why couldn't we? Because we are totally dependent on China for heparin. Contamination or not, as a member representing a large population of senior citizens, I can assure you that this is a critical and an issue we must address. To cripple the United States would have to do is embargo. To cripple the United States, all China would have to do is embargo the drug here. China did something similar in Japan in 2010 over a boating incident, I understand. In 2018, the problem has only gotten worse. In 2018, it was discovered that millions of Americans have been taking blood medication tainted with cancer-causing ingredients from China. According to the FDA, carcinogens may have been used in these foreign generics for as many as 4 years before being discovered. Please consider taking an active role in helping us advance these bipartisan bills. H.R. 6783, the American Space Commerce Act, and H.R. 5982, the Safe Medicine Act. The American Space Commerce Act will help our domestic launch industry and keep the United States a leader in space. The Safe Medicine Act will help save American lives and end our dependence on contaminated pharmaceuticals coming from China. Thank you very much for your consideration. I look forward to working with the China Task Force and my colleagues to address these issues that are so important to the American people, and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you for being here, sir. And on reference to 6783, the Space Commerce Act, based on your travels and your experience, what was the motivation for tax incentives for actually space launches on the United States soil?
Wow, thanks for asking that. You know, up until the 80s, the United States had a lock on virtually 100% of the world's commercial markets, or launches, commercial rocket launch market. But we choked the golden goose. We overregulated it. We had contracts with commercial providers that made it very onerous to do business in the United States. The French Ariane rocket, original one, was basically a carbon copy of our Thor Delta. And they blew up at least every third one. But it was still cheaper to launch with the French than it was to go to the United States. So we started to lose some business to them. And over the next couple of decades, we parlayed that 100% basically of the world's commercial launch market into about 15% for American companies. The other countries subsidize their launch companies. We don't. I mean, if you're a foreign customer launching a satellite from Kennedy Space Center, and you're lucky enough to get approved within 60 days to watch the launch, you're paying $60 million to put up a satellite for you, then you do it in a musty old blockhouse, dusty, standing up, probably watching the launch, maybe a can of Diet Coke, I don't know, When I went to French Guiana and saw the European Space Agency, they have, all Art Deco, glass enclosed launch control center, surrounded by a semicircle of those big lazy boy recliners, probably 100 of them, that they wine and dine the customers, treat them like kings, and of course their government, cooperates fully with them. So, we have the advantage technologically. We have the institutional knowledge and the experience to be first in space. We just haven't had the support of our government, and we never will have the support that the other governments are getting it. But we at least should go forward with giving some tax incentives if they launch from our soil. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman.
Posey.
Andy?
Oh, sorry. Andy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quick question. Representative Posey, thank you for your leadership on this, and especially on the American Space Commerce Act. Very interested in that and might want to co-sponsor it. Really appreciate your leadership on that. I represent a company called Space Tango. They do exomedicine. They provide space on the International Space Station for zero gravity medical experiments. And I just wanted to know, how would this maybe facilitate more of that science in zero gravity environment?
Well, it would definitely help bring costs down to them. Those are add-on costs, the taxes, obviously, that the customer ultimately has to pay. And it does hurt things. So, most people don't know at the International Space Station, we have real zero gravity that we can't duplicate here. Even with the centrifuge, we can't duplicate it here. But in the true, real zero gravity environment of our International Space Station, they can make pharmaceuticals, they can do drug tests that are 100% perfect. When you do the molecules and put the stuff together here on Earth, there's a percentage of loss from 100% quality that you get. You don't get 100% quality throughout because there's deviations due to gravitational forces that, some of which we don't understand. But the International Space Station, the crystals, 100% perfect. And they get their mutations expedited much quicker up there. So they're faster, and the technology advances faster, and we learn more, and we come up with new products. But it's been a godsend, and unfortunately, most of the United States just doesn't know much about it because it's not a big buzzword in the news all the time. But fortunately, there's people in Congress that appreciate it and respect it.
I appreciate your leadership on that.
Now, Mr. Joyce?
Representative Posey, thank you. Thank you for being here with us today and bringing forth H.R. 5982, the Safe Medicine Act. The China Task Force in the technology pillar have been studying and are keenly aware of the over-reliance on China, on the communist Chinese government, and what they have done specifically, as you had mentioned, in cornering the market on penicillin, ampicillin, amoxicillin. The vulnerability cannot continue. And your legislation is incredibly important and addresses this issue, and I too want to look to co-sponsor this with you as well. Thank you for bringing it forward to us today.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you.